My name is Jessica Lynne, and I'm a writer and a critic coming all the way from the planet of Brooklyn. I also co-founded ARTS.BLACK, which is a journal of art criticism from Black perspectives that I'll be talking a little bit more about. But I have to admit that when I was first invited, I struggled to figure out how my work was aligned with the themes of the conferences this year. And to be certain and very honest, I am not a technologist, nor do I consider myself an artist. But as a critic, I thought that what I might be able to offer in the simplest of terms is a short overview of what's happening in the digital publishing landscape, specifically using a few US-based examples of new journals and publications. Critics are often thought of as authoritative outsiders, lurking around artists, ready to kind of strike with opinions or hierarchical statements about what's working and what's not working. What I'd like to offer today is a consideration of the position of the critic as a type of intimate looker, writing alongside an artist rather than about an artist from this kind of aerial, top-down position. And as media and publishing landscapes have undergone their own changes, the digital space has really allowed a new generation of writers a chance to contribute to this discourse. So I'm hoping that today's, my short presentation today will give a fair, aerial sense of what's happening right now. What is offered? So I think that there are arguably many definitions of art criticism. And for the purposes of this conversation, I'd like to use the following as my working definition. Art criticism provides a tool through which we, the public, might think critically and perhaps collectively about cultural production. And acknowledging the kind of multiplicity of definitions that are roaming around here, I think that this working definition aims to make space for generous and generative relationships of reciprocity between artists, publics, writers, and institutions. So what is changing? If you are kind of in tune with these conversations, then you've probably heard something of the following. Everybody's an art critic. The internet has killed criticism. None of it matters anymore. We're all waiting in a host of subpar thoughts and opinions from unschooled, unskilled, unlearned folks even. And I guess my pushback to that would be that I think that there's always been subpar opinions floating around us. And I take issue with the idea that the internet has killed criticism because for me it becomes a coded complaint, often talking about the ways in which criticism is opening up outside of a more legacy establishment. And so I think that in a period where we realize that newspapers and magazines are cutting beats, ad revenue is disappearing, if you're a young writer of any discipline, right, and certainly as an arts writer or journalist, what other alternatives exist for you? And for many of us, the net and the web has become that alternative site. So I want to now kind of introduce you to two publications with whom I have been in conversation through ARTS.BLACK, and then I'll kind of dive further into my own work. First up, we have The Contemporary, who one of the editors is actually having a conversation today at the Wattis Institute tonight, if you're interested. But I want to bring them up and call attention to the work of Nazreen Hamada, Yusong Kim, and Kosh Gazaran. I first learned of The Contemporary in 2016 after the publication won a Warhol Foundation grant for arts writing. And I think that this project is really fascinating for two reasons that they identify themselves. Where they think about art criticism and the contempt as a commitment to clear the horizon for necessary ruptures. And even beyond that, rather, they're thinking about what happens after the ruptures and how new communities and new horizons are built from that kind of mess. Secondly, I'd like to draw your attention to Temporary Art Review, a St. Louis-based imprint of The Luminary, which is a nonprofit art organization there. Founded by Sarita Hun and James McAnally, Temporary Art Review emphasizes the breadth of projects taking place outside traditional art centers. The site uses an experimental anti-profit model driven by a bartering system that takes credit as a common currency to distribute value cooperatively amongst its contributors and readers. And then I'd be remiss, though not exclusively in art publication, to highlight the New Inquiry, which has come up in several ways here already, as an organization that's thinking explicitly about calling and culling in new voices, and then further articulating a political stance with the Bail Block as a perfect example of that. And I wanted to draw attention to contemporary and temporary art review because what is happening alongside ARTS.BLACK is a kind of explicit coalition that's forming of web-based journals who want to make a commitment and a stance about publishing in the digital landscape. And so for our part, we have started alongside a few other journals, Pelican in New Orleans, The Chart in Portland, Maine, to draft a manifesto, to be clear and direct and intentional about what we mean when we say we are publishers who think about artists and the arts that they are producing. So last November in Los Angeles at the Kinfolk conference, we kind of gathered together to invite the public into that conversation and are in the, hopefully, soon to be published stages of making that manifesto public so that other folks can kind of contribute, weigh in, and give feedback to us, a group of writers and editors who want to be quite clear that we are bringing in a subjective point of view and also, in most instances, a political kind of commitment with the work that we're doing. How might we understand sites of critique as interventions? So, in line with my previous examples is the mission of my own journal, ARTS.BLACK. And I think this question is quite central when we think more broadly about the role of writers in so many types of justice and resistance movements. Projects and writers who are not afraid to take up the subjective and, as I mentioned, radical sets of political beliefs. And in doing so, I'm positioning intimacy as a concept that it can become embedded in the task of criticism for widening and making available multiple canons within art history especially, that offer and introduce thinkers who do not fit within the categories of straight or white or male or able-bodied or so on and so forth. You could insert a host of identity verticals and marginalized positions in there. So what is ARTS.BLACK? I co-founded this really important project and journal 4 years ago with my dear friend and colleague, Taylor Renee Aldridge. We were both young women of color, specifically trying to think about what was at stake for us in the field and who we would serve through our work. One of the important questions we kept asking is why it felt like criticism always got to kind of operate outside of conversations of equity when conversations of equity in the arts came up. It was like the critics were these invisible beings, and what we really wanted to argue is that no, in order to have a full-fledged conversation about what's working and what's not working in an arts and culture infrastructure, you have to implicate the critic in that. And so we began to kind of ask these questions, specifically, where are all the young Black art critics? And it became both a rhetorical device and a way of meeting new people, in that we knew where the young Black art critics were. They were on the web, they were on Tumblr, they were creating all sorts of kind of interesting blogs and communities online. They just weren't being published by mainstream publications. And so Taylor and I gathered together and thought that ARTS.BLACK could be the place to do it, right? If we wanted to spark a conversation about the implications from the lack of published critical interpretations, then we had to use the resources that we had available to us, and we were digital natives, and so that resource was the internet. I like to think of ARTS.BLACK as something that embodies a core lineage of Black writers and Black artists who are using the collective as both a site of resistance and shelter. And I think especially of a really profound quote from Toni Morrison, where she simply states that if there's a story you want to tell and you don't see it, tell the story. And so I think as two Black women who wanted to see something in the world, we quite literally realized that we needed to offer it ourselves. So, here's a screenshot of the homepage, and I'll just give you kind of quickly a logistical overview. We started out as a Tumblr, which is kind of the only thing we knew how to do because we are not coders, we aren't developers, and Tumblr was free and available and kind of templated for us. We've since migrated over to a real website, working in partnership with an amazing developer and designer, Yasmin Vera, who's also in New York. We publish 2 essays or interviews or reviews a month, and we also pay our writers. We are fiscally sponsored through Creative Mini and was previously supported by the Allied Media Project based in Detroit, where Taylor lives. And so our mandate is to publish Black identified critics globally, although we place no kind of parameters on what those writers can write about. And in getting back to intimacy, I think what I want to argue is that we can make space for rigor that arises when critics can orient ourselves horizontally to the artist. What does criticism look like when we reject the myth that it can only manifest itself in one way? And often I'm met with the counter-argument that I think is a sound counter-argument. Does intimacy, or taking up the task of intimacy, do you lose objectivity? And is that, if you lose objectivity, can you consider that to be criticism? And I think I'm arguing that I can still produce rigorous, responsive, responsible conversations about what is at stake in the making process for an artist only when I'm embedded deeply in looking slowly at that process. So one of the more recent examples that I have been thinking about and in conversation with personally that I think may kind of fit into the themes embodied by today's gathering is the project Distributed Web of Care, organized by the artist and activist and educator Tae-Yoon Choi. So DWC is a research initiative that focuses on communication infrastructure and peer-to-peer alternative webs that prioritize collective agency and individual ownership of data and code. So I had the pleasure of participating in a Skillshare residency this summer when Tae-Yoon invited me to kind of help make this thing happen. Asking Tae-Yoon, again, I don't actually understand what I'm doing as a part of this Skillshare. What do I have to offer? But the idea, as I sat with it further, aimed to kind of think about an entanglement, right, of care with different practices, including the practices of makers, including artists and community organizers, and including those of us who are trying to kind of publicly articulate through text what it all might mean. The idea was to think about how interdependence and stewardship might allow us to collectively stand in opposition to dominant networks. And so I guess the closer I got to my own Skillshare workshop and the more that I've been reflecting on it after it took place a couple weeks ago is how exciting it was ultimately to be in conversation as a writer in this room. Because it forced me to think about how my own work and the interpretations I attempt to take on might point to larger societal concerns. This is to say that I'm trying to figure out how to better ask the questions, what is at stake for the artists and art that I attend to? And is art simply art for art's sake? In the Skillshare workshop, I discussed the role of trust between the writer and the artist. And as a group, using the web alternative, we kind of wrote letters using artwork as an entry point to discuss a thing that haunts us. So one writer took on the task of love and talked about heartbreak and used a particular work to kind of enter into that conversation. And then the letters were then shared through the peer-to-peer database here. Because I am not smart enough to figure out how to describe it for you, this is actually an example of how we began that process and what it looked like. And we spent about 3 hours adding doing this work with our individual computers, and the letters were then accessed using the computer's database exclusively and bypassing kind of Gmail or in Google and those sorts of things. And so I wanted to close out with a few words about a current project that I'm using intimacy as a framework, and specifically shout out Open Space, which is SFMoMA's digital platform. Yeah, they do really great work, and I think is another important example of what it might mean for digital platforms to take up the task of art criticism in new ways. And so earlier this winter, I was a columnist in residence at Open Space and began a project entitled Drafts for an Epic, which used the work of several Black women artists to kind of begin to meditate on and think about the 400th marker of Blackness in this country, which is next year, 2019, 400 years after 1619's first encounter with Black folks in this land. And so the project enabled me on a monthly basis to take up the work of artists such as Tiana Nakia McLauden, whose studio practice is largely looking at queer genealogies. In particular, it's focused on the work of several Black gay men who have since passed and their fractured archives. I also got to look at a new production by the surrealist playwright Adrienne Kennedy, and later closed out the residency with the work of sculptor and writer Beverly Buchanan. And so I think for me, in kind of taking the totality of what digital publishing is doing now, it is quite simply offering a certain type of inroad for folks who may not necessarily have immediate access to the networks of publishing, who may not necessarily be able to take those unpaid internships, and who really want to be able to contribute to new discourses around the work that artists are producing, and more largely, kind of the implications of that work. And so I hope that what we can continue to see, recognizing that the web might not ever be a neutral site, but that it may still be able to be complicated in ways that can offer new opportunities for folks who don't quite always fit in or have access to the immediate sort of resources that other folks might have access to. And so I'll close there. Thank you for listening.